But it's not really about change because we can't simply modify. We can't simply modify the system. The system was built on a legacy of racism and oppression. Therefore, we must truly dismantle the current system and recreate or co-create systems for health equity and for equity and inclusion. So why do we do this work? We're each going to speak to that ever so slightly. And where I want to begin is that I do this work because of my ancestors. I am not ahistorical in my perspective. I do this work because somebody, probably at least 3 people, survived the Middle Passage. I do this work because multiple ancestors survived enslavement. I do this because one ancestor, Austin Bland, survived escape over the Mason-Dixon line. Austin Bland was my great-great-grandfather. That's not that far removed from today. My name is Leann Johnson, and I was named after Leon Bland. Leon Bland was the first person, the first family member, the first individual in my mom's family to be born above the Mason-Dixon line in Keokuk, Iowa, and to be born into what at that time was called freedom. And as we know today, we are still not free. My family also, I do this work because they also survived Jim Crow, a variety of exclusion laws, particularly here in the state of Oregon, and threats of death and cross burning. So when I'm asked why I do this work, I do it because of all these individuals that had far more resilience than I have. I've been in situations where I've been threatened. I've been in situations where I have had to have a bodyguard to do this work in settings like this. But that's nothing whatsoever. It doesn't take any amount of resilience to do this work for me today. When I compare that to what my ancestors, what my family went through and survived so that I could be here.
Let's go down the line.
Yep, we're going to go down the line, Dan. You're next. So what grounds you, and who are you versus what you do, Ben?
Great. So Ben Duncan, Chief Diversity and Equity Officer at Multnomah County. I love this question, in part because I think we, for folks that are in positions of authority as people of color, often in institutions, we're always grappling and thinking about how do we bring our full selves to those spaces. We're always navigating and calculating what that really means. And so I think grounding in who we are, not kind of what our bios are or what our professional affiliations, as important as that is. So I stand here today I sit here today in my full self, right, as the son of an African-American father whose family was from Alabama, part of the Great Migration north to Syracuse, New York. I sit here as the son of a white Jewish mother from the Bronx, who's also these 2 families, right, of the stories of slavery and liberation being a deep connection into our identities. And I stand here as a husband of a beautiful and brilliant Latina whose family's from El Paso, Texas. As Dr. Jones referenced, right, the border moved, they didn't move. And I stand here as a father of a little black Mexican Jewish kid, right? So he'll be dealing with that. But really thinking about the relationship that I've spent, really my whole life trying to think about and bridge the connections between these identities, right? These cultural and spiritual identities, right? And I think that's been a real contributor to the way that I've focused my work, both in organizing when I was younger, really thinking about how do you bridge connections between people, between communities, and in my work and career, really thinking about, again, this metaphor of a bridge between race and racism and the type of outcomes that we see in our environmental and economic and educational and other kind of structural systems. So for me, the exploration of my own identity has also been an exploration of how we can think about these connections, these bridges in the work that we do every day.
Tatsmewi, Oikala Inam Himuma, Kalautiwama. Inwaniksha Tatokatimki, Patiwas, Ka Soyapo Timki, Lindsey Watchman. In Tamina Hiwas Laloitsa Kipium Kitpa. Good morning. My Indian name is Patiwas, and my European name is Lindsey Watchman. I am happy to be with you all this morning here at this gathering. The question was, who am I? So I'll wait for my title and transition to my role in my community right now. I am a father of 6, soon to be 7. My wife is accompanying me. That's great news in May. I also am a grandfather of 1. I'm an enrolled member of the Confederated Tribes of the Umatilla Indian Reservation. My father is full-blooded and my mother is not full-blooded. Her ancestry comes from the Finnish side, which homesteaded just on the other side of our reservation, part of my reservation. My ancestor story I'll share with you later, just so you have some more context about our health, equity, and disparities. But I also served in the military. I was in the Air Force for 7 years back in the Persian Gulf War. So I've been a soldier, 91 to 98. An educator, again, parent, grandparent, and now I feel like I'm, just like the rest of you in the room, a caregiver, healers even. So again, I just want to, thank you all for welcoming me here today, and I feel like I'm in the room where people in the room care about people instead of other capitalistic ventures. It's good to be here. Yokolo.
Good morning. Can everybody hear me? So, good morning. I want a good morning back from everybody, though.
Good morning.
Thank you. So, as I'm sitting here to express who am I, first and foremost, I am a second-generation Black Oregonian. And since Black Oregonians are kind of rare now, I like to start with that. And the reason that's important to me, and especially as we look at equity, is being a Native Oregonian. The whole of the state, the whole of the state's history is part of my individual identity. And I always like to start with that identity with this. December 24th, 1854, Multnomah County was incorporated in the Oregon Territory. And it was one of those first 13 counties. And February 14th, 1859, it was part of the decision-making body that created the state of Oregon. And within that decision, part of that foundation was exclusionary laws to make this a safe haven from slavery. That's actually part of my identity as an Oregonian. Now, another part of that is this. For many people, for many years in my family, we've accepted and we've always said, Oregon didn't want us here, but this is where God started us here, so you can't take it from me. And the reason that's important is I like to say, Oregon as a state, and part of the identity of where I come from, has always been leading with race. And as we look at Oregon's history, that ahistorical perspective we don't attach to, part of that meant we were excluded. So in forums like this, I bring this up because what I hold on to is I don't want Oregon to ever stop leading with race. We weren't scared to do it at our inception to be exclusionary. All I ask now in the 21st century, as we are Oregonians and we define who we are, let's not lose that courage, but let's turn it into how do we become an inclusionary state. Let me say that again. I don't think some of y'all caught that. How do we take that lack of fear about discussing race out of an exclusionary space and make it inclusionary? And I think really, because I'm honest, and when I speak to white Oregonians, I'm not asking for you to let that part about race go. I'm asking for all of us to change the paradigm and embrace what made Oregon. And so I'm really happy to be here, and I think I'll pass it on.
It's tricky to ask a clinical social worker who they are in a few minutes. So my name is Mandy Davis. My given name was Mildred Ann, because by the time I was born, no grandchildren had been named after grandmothers. And I was born in North Carolina and raised in North Carolina. And in the South, that's sacrilegious to not be named after the mother of the family. So I was born into a white, middle-class, Episcopal family in North Carolina, and I do the work mostly because of I do the work for a variety of reasons over life. But my first influencer, maybe some choice, but really is, Dr. Jones talked about value is something we're not talking about as much. But my grandmother, who died in May at 98, had me serving Meals on Wheels at the age of 5. And definitely was kind of an activist in the South around issues of race and desegregated the Girl Scouts and other organizations to work for that. So I was brought up in this idea of this work being important, but it was also very much a work done on an individualist nature. Like you were to serve, you were to be present, you were to do for others, you were to give for others. What life up until now has given me in some different examples, and the one I just want to speak to is my first job as a counselor was working in domestic violence and sexual assault. And it was kind of the very traditional dominant culture model of 1 hour of therapy, reimbursable, was somehow going to solve problems. And I felt horribly inadequate. I mean, every night I would go home and be like, I don't know what I'm doing, and I don't know why I'm doing it, and I don't know why people keep showing up. And when I felt most successful when I was navigating the system for the families I was serving, when I was manipulating the system, navigating the system, getting resources, getting food, getting vouchers. And it wasn't until later that I realized, because I was good at it, I was really good at it, which made it felt good. And I realized I was good at it because the systems were developed by people who look like me, for people who look like me. And that's why I was good at it, and it seemed easy to do. And it was sitting with that and sitting with all of the other work I've done with survivors that I realized that people, and you know this, we know this, but people know what they need to heal. It's the structures and the systems that get in the way of that. And I just will end on a grief. We did a project one time with grief and loss in immigrant populations, and I learned listening to Russian immigrants that we all grieve, but we all grieve differently. In the South, you polish your silver and you make casseroles. It's what you do. And in other cultures, are going to sit in meditation or dance in the streets. But when we deny people access, what they taught me is when you deny people access to even the things you need to do the work of your people or of your culture, if that's not available, then you stunt that process, right? Then you can't grieve if you can't dance in the street or have that particular food that's important to that ceremony. And all of that listening and learning, for many, many years, sat me to say, people know what they need. And so it's learning. So I do the work to figure out where the system needs to play and where the system is doing harm and where the system needs to step out. And so trying to figure that out. That's why I do the work.
Right. Actually, Mandy can keep that because she's going again. But thank you so much, panelists, for sharing a bit of who you are and the why behind the work that each of us do. We're going to spend some time now talking kind of at two different levels, but 3 different topics. And I'd like you to also know that we just made up our time as well. So this part is supposed to start at 11:30. It's 11:32, just for those of you that are worried about time. So each panelist will now speak to community level and workplace level and individual level regarding this work. So Mandy will talk about the trauma-informed movement, and then Royal and Lindsey will talk about work at the community level to intertwine in that some individual stories, I would hope. And then Ben will talk about this work at the level of the workplace. So that's how we're going to slice and dice this right now. And I will turn it over to Mandy to start with information about the trauma-informed movement, how that relates to equity, what you might see as some of the deficits in that right now, what's going on, where are there inherent conflicts in trauma-informed and equity work, and what do we need to know, what more do we need to know in grounding ourselves around trauma?
Excellent. So I'm really excited to take a few minutes to talk about this intersection of trauma-informed care and equity, or the intersection we're not paying attention to or need to do better of. Mm-hmm. So those of you who know me here in Oregon, I'm steeped in the trauma-informed care movement. It's what I do. It's what I talk about. And so just to really quickly ground that, trauma-informed care, from the standpoint of trauma-informed Oregon and the work we're doing here in Oregon, is a system-changed approach. So trauma-informed care is about changing systems with using the knowledge about toxic stress, the impact of toxic stress and trauma on those we serve, but really importantly also on our workforce, and how that impact makes it hard to engage in services. So that's really what trauma-informed care is, right? So system organizational change effort, utilizing knowledge about the impact of toxic stress. I think a really important message that I really kind of want to just throw out some things to you that we're grappling with around the conflicts of this stuff in hopes that it'll kind of come up in conversation and question, and will keep coming up as we talk about trauma-informed care as a movement. So one big important message, right, is that there are plenty of people who've been doing trauma-informed care way before we called it trauma-informed care. Right, and so we want to pay attention to that as we move through. Mm-hmm. I've started to say, and I think it's important, do you all know that trauma-informed care has gotten kind of popular? So these are things I kind of want your help to, again, play with, grapple with, but also keep on the table as people are talking about it. As I think that trauma-informed care is the adjective. It's not the noun. You don't go get trauma-informed. Right? You need housing, you need health care, we need food, we need safe neighborhoods. We need those things. We want them to be done in a trauma-informed, equitable, inclusive way. And so I just want us to be thinking about that because it's getting written in a different way. It's getting written as a noun, and I want to be careful of that. Being trauma-informed care means changing the way that your spaces, like your lobbies, how people engage in your services, where your services are, who's providing your services. Importantly, the policies and procedures that allow for eligibility, accessibility, right? So that's what trauma-informed care is grounded in. This all came about because of, right now, and you probably have heard this, we're talking about the adverse childhood experiences and trauma and toxic stress, our public health crisis, because of the impact that these things have on our bodies, right, and on our health. Now, the movement of trauma-informed care, I believe, originally was a people's movement. It was survivors saying, this isn't working for us. The way you do services is not working for us. And we need to remember that, because as things get popular, sometimes they get shifted or changed or talked about kind of not necessarily in the most helpful way. So a couple things I'm going to throw down the table, because what I'm most excited about is you to hear how people are actually doing the work. Is one, the difference of trauma-specific versus trauma-informed care, right? So trauma-specific services are things that are geared to help individuals and families. Trauma-informed care is about changing organization and structures. So two different things. So you may need to do both. Everyone should be doing trauma-informed care. Not everyone should be doing trauma-specific, which is an important thing as you're out talking, as people are writing policies around this. I need you to be good ambassadors of that, because it's not about having everyone certified in a white dominant mental health tech, EMDR or something like that, right? It's about changing the way we do the work. The second thing I think is really critically important about the intersection of trauma-informed care and equity that we are talking about, but just talking about, so I'm looking forward to more people joining that conversation, is that you aren't doing trauma-informed care if you're not talking about the impact of racism, sexism, ageism, ableism, heterosexism. If you're not dismantling structures that cause harm, then you're not trauma-informed. And that's important. So what we tend to say is if you're doing great equity work, you're already doing trauma-informed care work, right? But you can do trauma-informed care work and not be doing equity and inclusion work. So it's important that we center the work around equity and inclusion, and how can trauma-informed care help that work. And this is kind of leads me into the next point that I think is important, is that I don't know if you've noticed, but the trauma-informed care movement is pretty white. And so we actually are really asking ourselves in the movement, how can we decolonize even the trauma-informed care movement? What does that mean? And that's anywhere from the language you use. The word trauma doesn't translate. It doesn't translate in different languages. It doesn't often represent, from the listening sessions we're having, it doesn't represent someone who's living as a person of color, who gets up in the morning every day is dealing with structural racism. The word trauma doesn't tend to fit that. So anywhere from the language, or if we're using words that person is activated versus saying that person is reacting to racism, those are the things that, so I mean, even thinking about how we need to shift this movement, and that's just a beginning conversation. So Trauma-Informed Oregon started talking about this a little bit, and people are like, yes, we need to have this conversation. So I want us to be careful, even in this movement, that we're doing that. One of the questions we're asking in communities around the state is, how is the trauma-informed care movement helping or hurting your community and the work in your community? And what responsibility do we have to make sure that we can change that or shift that as possible? And I think I want to stop. So the last thing I want to say is that it's not a one-size-fits-all method, and so I'm excited that we'll hear different opportunities here of how it looks on the ground.
Thank you. Thank you, Mandy. So now we're going to move to information about the Healthy Birth Initiatives and the Yellowhawk Tribal Center to talk more at the community level of, and I would also say individual, as individuals interact at the community level. So how do we design programs that are healing centered? Let's put it that way. How do we design models and programs that respond to and not just respond or acknowledge, but truly redress trauma?
I think first and foremost, and I want to thank Dr. Jones for a lot of what she said, because a lot of it's centered around language. And I think for me, one of the things, especially in marginalized communities, is the language that's imposed on them. There's a certain pedagogy when it comes to how we look at how we heal or help people. And for me, it always breaks down to a couple of words. People who know me know I'm a word nerd. And so even in our discussion and dialogues today, a couple things. Interesting, I love Mandy. And when we talk about how do we decolonize trauma-informed care because we can't find it, actually trauma is rooted in the Latin word for wound. So really the first thing we would have to do is ask, are we doing wound-informed care? Which allows each individual from their own ethnic perspective, from their own economic perspective, to describe how they've been wounded. Because a wound is a very personal thing. And once we get to there, then we can have that robust discussion. But also I think, especially working with communities, there's two languages, and I always use one word that epitomizes it, and that word is address. Most systems want to address inequities. And if you look up the word address, how we apply it is the 14th definition, which means to direct our attention at something. For most communities, we want to redress issues, and that means to remedy or set right an undesirable or unfair situation up to and including compensation. And the reason that's important is most systems of inequity and that power imbalance have to change once we apply the right words. And I was looking at this, and I was already thinking about it, and looking at those two words, because for me, we can address a lot of stuff, but that usually comes down to how we identify things, how we research, how we discuss, how we mobilize invested parties, because that's looking at it and dealing with it. But when we redress something, we're talking about strategy, we're talking about operation, we're talking about service delivery, data collection, most importantly, compensation for harm. But most communities don't have this language. Or just as importantly, when policies or procedures come out with these words, communities haven't been empowered to really dig deeper and say, what do you mean by that? Does that word reflect the help I need, or does it reflect the institutional adverse conditions they don't want to deal with? And I think until we start to empower our communities with that, and also within our systems, I'm a firm believer, most people go to work and do great work at a work plan without ever getting the opportunity to ask, does this really move the needle? Does this really change inequity? Are we even defining these words right? One of the things that happens in social service is we get to redefine words. And what happens, we also dilute the impact of those words. Or we don't allow those words to do what some of them are intended for. Box us into a decision. And that decision about the outcomes and the measurements of that decision. So I think as we look at how we help communities, and within HBI, working with fathers, one of the concepts I've had to introduce with us is intra-equity. Because within the family structure, there are inequalities in how we look at the role of fathers, how we look at fatherhood health, how we look at his role in helping. But we have to really be succinct in the words we use to really get at the roots of the problems we want to redress.
So, Indian people know lots about trauma. We call it intergenerational trauma. And our trauma, of course, begins with early contact. Central Americans down near Hispaniola, Haiti, their trauma began when Columbus landed upon their shores. For a more modern context, the move to the reservation has started really a lot of our health disparities. that's one method in the 1800s. And when I do my canned speech later, I'll bring us all the way back to 1800, because this timeline is important to the context. Again, moving it from the individual trauma level to a family unit, to a community unit, and then take that over 200 years, okay? After the reservation became the boarding school, right? General Pratt, military Civil War officer, started the first Native American boarding school in Pennsylvania called Carlisle. And the motto was, kill the Indian, save the man. That's the preface that boarding schools for Native Americans started. I graduated in 1990 from Chemawa boarding school. It's out here in Salem. In 1990, I enjoyed myself. In fact, I transferred there because I was moved to an urban location and I didn't have any identity with my tribal people in northeastern Oregon. So that's what I did my senior year. Great experience. But for many of my grandmother went there in 1933 and my dad went there in 1970. Okay. Again, on the outside, it looks like, yeah, you're taking Indian kids, helping out their communities, teach them in a trade. The girls are learning how to sew and cook and all those kind of things. Men were laying bricks and being carpenters. You know, that's a vocational trade school. Good idea. But these kids were taken. The health system back in the day said, no, we know what's best for your Indian kids. What you're doing, the way you're raising them, isn't proper in our eyes. So they came and took them. Imagine being a woman with 4 or 5 kids. You're 5-year-old, you're 7, you're 10, you're 12, you're 14-year-old, just taken by the system. What about the husband? So all the kids are taken down to Chemawa, many of them trying to run away. They don't like it. Just like the military, I said I was in the Air Force. First thing they do is cut your hair and put you in a uniform so you lose your individual identity. It's an important operant conditioning. You're a team now. Be selfless, right? That's the extreme that boot camp is about, okay? You're doing that to little kids. They're lost. They don't have mom and dad. They don't know what's going on. Now they're talking Indian. They don't know English. You haven't taught them yet. You're washing their mouth out with soap. Bodies. Every boarding school has cemeteries. Kids that didn't come back to their parents. What is mom going to do when she's all alone on that reservation waiting for her kids she may never see again? May never even come back alive. The dad, what's he supposed to do? Lost his purpose. He's going to drink. They're going to be lost. Okay? And then let's look back at the survivors of that boarding school system. Again, we got fathers and nuns with the Bible in their hands saying what you are and who you are is wrong. Follow this Bible during the day. And at night, they're creeping into the beds. Using religion, God, as their tool, dehumanizing our little ones. They survive. What do? They're going to hang out with another survivor, 18 years old. Now they're out there trying to be parents. What kind of parenting have they seen? They come back to the reservation, they don't know how to be Indians again. Language loss. My dad's generation, who is the baby boomers, language loss. Don't do it. Kids have been traumatized. You don't be Indian. Hide it. Civil rights movement. Hide it. That's why the American Indian movement, pride in your tribe, came back in the early 70s. These things still happen today, are still affecting us today. Those parents are still grandparents. A lot of abuses still are perpetual and cyclical because we haven't dealt with our ACEs, our adverse childhood experiences. I'm at a 7.5. And I'm a success story. I've come up from the muck, at least in some measurements, you know. But I have a whole community like that. And we don't want to go anywhere. We've got to figure it out. We're going to be in the muck. We're going to take it upon ourselves. My wife has spent years in suicide prevention, youth prevention activities. Yeah, definitely upstream. So I'll close with that. We definitely know about trauma. and it is intergenerational trauma. So again, thank you all.
Thank you. And Ben, you have some information you're going to share about some of the workforce work you're doing, so to speak, around systems change, equity.
Yeah, I feel like I need to sit for a minute,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
No, don't apologize. I mean, I think we all need to sit for a minute, right, to hold what was just described and what that means and how that shows up. Right? So it feels like a little bit of an unnatural transition. So I'm just going to hold that for a second. I think, and I can encourage folks. I'm going to talk a little bit about the work that Multnomah County has done around workforce equity. I'd encourage folks, you can Google Multnomah County Workforce Equity Strategic Plan. I'm not going to talk about the elements of the plan. What I want to talk about is some of the values and principles that we've tried to embed in our practice and our process that I think is transferable to any systems change work. As I was listening to Dr. Jones this morning, and I'm like, well, there's a lot of alignment with what was described, and which I guess if you're aligned with what Dr. Jones is saying, then I think you're in a pretty good position. So I'll hold that as well. So I'm not going to talk about the elements of the plan, but I do think that I'll hit on a few pieces that hopefully folks can take out of this room today and bring to the institutions that you're at. And the first one, as we heard this morning, is the importance of leading with race. And I think as we continue to think about how we do that within our institution, ensuring that leading with race is not at the exclusion of others, but the inclusion, right, to some of Royal's points. And recognizing within that conversation, and I think even about my own kind of positional space, right, that we have to acknowledge, not just as an institution, but I think for many of us in leadership, our own complicity in maintaining some of these structures that are actually creating incredible harm for other human beings. Right, I don't think I'd be in my job if I wasn't skilled at navigating and maintaining kind of white supremacy culture within our institution, even as I'm working every day to try to dismantle and disrupt that. Right, I spent my whole life, as I alluded to earlier, thinking about my racial identity in the context of race and how that shows up. I have not spent my whole life thinking about my own masculinity. Right, that is work that I need to do, work that many of us in this room need to do on a daily basis, because we are complicit in maintaining these things if we're not. So I think the power of leading with race, combined with this concept that we have kind of borrowed, I'll say, from Professor John Powell at the Haas Center at Berkeley, called targeted universalism. It means that we can lead with race, but we still set universal goals, right? So in the context of workforce equity, we're saying that we want, for example, all of our employees to thrive. But if we don't understand what that means for how our different employee populations are situated in the context of our institution, in the context of our communities, then we are not going to develop strategies that work for everyone. Right? It's a powerful concept, and again, something you all can Google. There's plenty of work out there around it. But again, it's about saying this is not just about eliminating disparities, it's about achieving universal outcomes that are about all people reaching their full potential, all people thriving. The second piece, and I think this really is around the concept of building and sharing power. But the notion that we center the voices of those who are most negatively impacted in decisions that affect their lives. There's an old, I grew up in the kind of EJ, environmental justice work. There's an old adage that says communities that speak for themselves best protect themselves. So when we think about, I was at a workshop not that long ago, and someone said, if we want to figure out what's going to work for folks in the organization, we have to come up with the solutions that work for those who are the most managed in our organization. By centering the voices, it means that you're giving space and creating the conditions where people can share openly their pain, You're not ignoring the legacy and historical context of what folks have experienced in an organization like Multnomah County. And I could spend, the next 3 hours telling stories about how folks have exposed their scars, described their experiences, left the organization. We can't ignore that. Centering the voices means, to Dr. Jones's language, right, assigning a value to the wisdom and experience of those folks, again, who are most negatively impacted by the isms and the trauma, right, of racism and sexism and homophobia and ableism, etc. And then I think the last thing I'll talk about is really what we can learn in government. And I know we may talk about, some of these tactics in the conversation later. But what perhaps I was most proud of in the work that we've done at Multnomah County is really this concept of trying to take community organizing models and social justice movement models and try to bring them into government. Right? I know there's a couple folks out here that are part of our Employees of Color Employee Resource Group. When we think about the work that they were doing to organize employees within the institution, working not just within the institution, but outside with our labor partners and community-based organizations. Right? Literally showing up and telling, the pain of their stories to our elected officials. These are staff organizing, showing up together. But it also meant that as folks were organizing and building power, that folks like me and folks that are in positions of authority are challenging ourselves about what it means to share power. Right? And again, we could have a whole conference about what it means to build and share power. Right? What does that mean for all of you that have positions of authority? I don't use the term leadership positions. I say positions of authority within the organizations. Because what that meant for our process is that our employees got to own and create the spaces where folks were not just sharing their experiences, but being able to tell their stories in ways that they felt safe doing so. It meant that the data that came out of that and the developed themes that would then inform our work, that they were doing that analysis, they were owning the data, right? And there's tons of critiques. We could, this is not a perfect situation. But it also meant that they created the spaces where the strategies that we adopted as an organization were developed by our frontline staff. Because they organized, because they used story, qualitative and quantitative data, that they were able to move leadership in our organization, right? Build power. Right? So those tactics, I believe, could be transferable to any systems change. Right? The grassroots organizing, shifting and moving power, utilizing and leveraging data, both qualitative and quantitative. All right, so I'm really proud of where we ended up, but I think I'm more inspired by the ways that I'm seeing frontline folks in our community organizations coming together, our labor partners being able to continually push this organization. So when people say, what does it look like to have accountability? Well, you have some folks that are going to show up to the board meeting if you don't do this. Right? To have a public conversation and a public challenge. So I'll leave it at that.
So as I'm hearing our panelists speak, what is really resonating with me is the absence of separation. Context is content for us. Our wound is our work. Intergenerationally, we have transmitted both the negative and positive aspects of who we are. And in a work system, social justice has a place. It must have a place. When we in this nation today hold and have held our children hostage so their parents will behave appropriately, and we've been doing that from boarding schools, from enslavement to boarding schools, and now to our populations of children that are moving north on a border that moved on them. We haven't changed that much. And when Dr. Jones talked about it's going to take a generation, but a generation if we start now, if we really take this seriously now, in 20 years we may start seeing those outcomes shift. But right now we have to address the inequities. If we address and redress the trauma, the hurt, the wound, and the inequities now, we may see better outcomes in 20 years. We may. It's not written that will happen. And so on that note, would just very much like to thank and honor the panelists that shared what they shared in a very deep and meaningful way, because that's the only way we're going to really understand our stories and understand our paths forward. So 2 things. We will have some time for questions, but I also know that Lindsey, you had some information you wanted to share about Yellowhawk Clinic. Is that correct? Sure. Would you like to do that now? We can fit it in there if you would like to spend a few minutes on that. I want to make sure I meet your expectations, and at the same time, if you would like to, I know you prepared some slides.
I'm a social studies teacher. Do you want a little bit of social studies to go with the health?
And then we'll open it up to some questions. And we have 15 minutes for your piece and questions.
All right.
Is that going to work?
Here we go. I'm going to get up and stand.
Okay.
Yeah, so again, I graduated from boarding school in 90, joined the Air Force in 91, got out in 98, Persian Gulf War, came and went. Then I moved home. Again, I had grown up as a off the reservation, so that's what you call an urban Indian. Urban Indian experience is very much different than the reservation experience. Just by a wild guess, anybody know how many federally recognized tribes there are in the state of Oregon? I heard the right answer. 9. Okay. How many are there in the entire United States? Close. There are 6 more that were added recently. Okay. There are 573 federally recognized tribes in the United States and Alaska. Half of those are villages, but again, that's what we're talking about in regards to tribal governmental structure and separate sovereign units taking care of their people and especially their health care. So I'm going to have to figure this out. Okay, so on your tables there are several handouts. Okay, let me see. I'm supposed to be able to go forward and backwards. Cool. All right. So a few graphics will show you. Again, context is our content. Our wound is our work. Okay, I'd spent 17 years in Oregon Indian education because I thought that was the easiest way to get my tribal members self-sufficient. Not depending on the county for social services, not dependent on the tribe, but being individually sovereign, self-sufficient, self-determining. Okay, so I thought education was the route. It's what most of us in education believe is the route, and it is certainly one of the routes. But what if your people don't want to leave the reservation to go get that education? Okay, they want on-the-job training. I don't want to go anywhere. My cousins, aunties, uncles, grandma, relatives, they're all here. I don't want to go to the institution, bring the institution to us somehow. Okay? We are actually over 3,100 now, but out of 7 billion people in the world, I kind of consider myself an endangered species. There's only 3,100 members of the Confederated Tribes of the Umatilla Indian Reservation. To me, that's manageable. That's my little chunk of the world in the pie as an Oregonian, responsible also to my county's health. But again, these are the people, my relatives, who have survived lots of different forced assimilation tactics, are still here, resilient, beautiful, wonderful, smart geniuses in their own right. But again, we have an unusual kind of population distribution as well. That's very, that doesn't look like most counties or the state of Oregon at all. There's a much, and again, half of us live on or off the reservation. Again, there ain't a whole lot on some reservations. My reservation, I'm very fortunate. I complained when I was 18, when I first left my reservation. Went after my high school sweetheart after Chemawa. She lived in northeastern Montana, Poplar, Wolf Point. Man, that's a rugged reservation. I will never complain about my housing units when I went and seen some of these other tribal communities. Pine Ridge, I'm not going to complain. But I'm going to, on my scale of relativity, I'm going to keep working on what I can control. Okay, so these 3,100 people related to me by blood, love, or even sometimes involuntary, right? Too many people living in the same house. Okay. So our health disparities, our health issues, our entire way of life began with Lewis and Clark. We were one of the tribes in their manuscript after the Nez Perce brought him down the Bitterroot River in 1803, 1804. They met the Umatilla, the Walla Walla peoples. We were more bands. We weren't tribes. Just people with villages and eels and salmon being dried on the side. And at that time, we had 10,000 horses. We had 10,000 horses because 100 years earlier, we acquired the Spanish Mustang as the Spanish Wars, and that horse was being reintroduced. That changed our whole migratory pattern. But this map here is also representing what we call our ceded territory. That's the green area. So when we signed our treaty in 1853, the Lewis and Clark came and went. We got that path, that Navajo path, commerce with the Indians. One of my tribal leaders got a Jefferson Peace Medal. Okay, we took care of the core. Okay, then come the wagon train, right? Lots of people, 500,000 people flooding in 20-year time. That's just going to cause cramped conditions, right? And if you are a people who is used to, we got a bunch of Oregonians in here, so you should recognize this, okay? 6.4 million acres. That's what that green area represents. And that is the territory that we ceded during our treaty negotiations in 1855, okay? Basically, what we're saying is, okay, there's Columbia River. This is about Arlington's right about here. Any of you from Tri-Cities, you got Hanford. That's why we're always dealing with Hanford issues. Our tribe puts a lot of money in the Columbia River because our salmon, okay? For 70 years, our first food's one of our most hallowed sacred foods, the salmon. The first animal to stand up and say, hey, when the humans come naked, they're coming to this planet, thus animals have to figure out how to take care of them. It was the salmon said, I'm going to come back twice a year. As long as they respect me and show respect, I'll keep coming back. The elk, the deer stood up again. They could have my meat to feed them. They could have my hide to clothe them and housing. Again, each of the animals took turns. The roots and the berries all made a promise to the human people to take care of them before we had a word called race, okay? So this area represents over a year, our seasonal round. Over a year's time, we didn't go in just a circle, but these are different elevations. You got a peak right here, you got mountain ranges here, you got lowlands here, plateau. But from watershed all the way to mountaintop. At one time, we had the ability to roam freely around that. Housing got cramped. The reservation system came up. We signed a treaty saying we will live right here in this little area. But we still want access to all these other areas because our roots and our berries are over there. Our medicine's up here by Hanford. Some are glowing these days, okay? But we got all kinds of stuff that we've survived on in our little circular round, our seasonal round. Over here you had the warm springs. Up here you had Yakima. Over here you got the Nez Perce. And by the way, that's the language I was speaking to you earlier in, is Nez Perce. Okay? So again, condensed. Now we live in a food desert, all right? So you got all these other different historical traumas. See which slides you got here.
So again, just social studies teacher, I thought this was the time that would happen. So again, I just want to share with you a little bit about Yellowhawk, because it's an entirely different health system than most every one of you are experienced with. You know, it's based on those treaties. Let me see if that slide got in there. Nope. Uh-oh, help me. Ah!
I will not be able to help you. I'm so sorry.
IT.
Can
All
you
right.
just finish?
Yeah, let me just see
one.
see one of my.
Here.
All right, thank you. Jeez. All right, got me nervous. So again, these are the people that we have to take care of. Again, lots of intergenerational trauma. From our Kathla, right? This lady here she's one of our last fluent speakers. And when I started learning the language, there was 12 to 15 of our elders in our small community that still learned the language when they were growing up. They didn't know how to teach it. That was our job, going to school and coming back with our degrees and stuff. You know, but they were so afraid of the white man taking their language and going out making money and seeing it on Rosetta and, you know, Rosetta Stone or something. Very personal. Language is identity. Okay? So, again, we got a lot of work to do. We've got a lot of elderly to take care of and a lot of youth to take care of. Fortunately, you know, those are good focus groups, right? So, again, we do a lot of prevention work with our youth. A lot, again, trying to get upstream to what's causing these problems and what we could actually take care of, you know, in-house.
Okay. I think we'll take some questions maybe now from the, are you? Yeah, okay, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Sure. So, again, we are a primary care facility. Almost every reservation has their own little facility local. And so, again, we're trying to keep everything on the reservation. We're not using county resources. We're not using state resources. We have our own funding stream that comes through the Bureau of Indian Affairs and Indian Health Services. Okay? And, again, see, so that we can only provide the equipment that we have and the knowledge of the staff in-house, which is, you know, we're in a rural community. So, again, you can see some of the services that are provided there. This is a big one, and I'm going to end on this because I think this is where a question or two might be asked. Okay, so IHS. Again, IHS stands for Indian Health Services. This is like Uncle Sam to us. Okay, so again, in those treaties, it said that they would help us with medical care, the U.S. government, with a mill, with housing and education. So again, they have, but to marginal degrees. But here we are, still very dependent on IHS. $25 million budget at Yellowhawk, $11 million at IHS. Anybody know that the government shut down right now? Sequester a few years ago. If a third of your budget's coming from the federal government and nobody's answering their phone, what do you think about all that paperwork and stuff that needs to be approved? We're talking about health care. This is education, housing, economic development, other areas that federal government provides funding to. So then we have to, again, tribes, and I'll close with this for questions. Third-party revenue, thank you, State of Oregon, Oregon Health Authority, right, Affordable Care Act. This would have came out of our base budget, which, again, over here, would have went quick. 20 years ago, we used to just give up on dental care around July, August, because we had to wait for federal funding to come back in, okay? So what I want to close with is the other third of our budget is grants, indirect. Tribes have become successful since the early 70s in writing for grants because, again, we have all the health disparities. We have the community health assessments. Now we can finally, as nonprofits, write for those same federal grants and then try to do things, local control, local decision-making. And, again, that's why we've taken some of the control away from IHS, developed our own health commission. So we've been basically local control over our health for the last 22 years.
Thank you, Lindsey.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much, Lindsey, for sharing that. I think it's we often, I think, in these settings, get very little line of sight to our indigenous peoples that were here many, many years and surviving just fine until colonization happened. So thank you, Lindsey, for sharing that. I think we have a few minutes. We are going to take a few minutes for questions, and then we'll have each panelist close out very quickly. So we were told that we could delay lunch ever so slightly, and we will do that ever so slightly. And does anyone have any questions for any of our panelists? Please speak now, and go to the microphone, please. Oh, there's a question coming? No. All right. This is a photographer. Take her. So we'll give an opportunity for each panelist to close out, bring it full circle for each of us on the panel. Mandy? Oh, question. Okay.
For Mr. Royal, around the father piece. So I know that dads have trauma for many reasons. Their role historic in the household, but particularly for African American men or men who identify black, with the trauma that's happening nationally across the country. What are you all doing specifically? Any type of rituals or workshops, or like how are you helping them with the trauma?
And so to that point, I think black men always experience trauma. It's kind of like, if you're an African American man, it's kind of like part of birth. So, and I think one of the things that we do and what we're instituting as it relates to families is during our intake process, when we have pregnant mothers, they're screened for depression, stress and anxiety, and intimate partner violence. And so one of the things we really want to do is when we get a mother in, is bring that father in as part of the unit and create the space where those same assessments can be done for him. Because a part of that equity is we don't want the unequal balance of her being seen as a whole person and all of her needs being met, whether physical or emotional, and him not receiving the same. One of the equations I always say is, if we have a healthy mother and we've assessed for those risks, if we have a healthy child and we've assessed for those risks, but we never consider the risk the father faces, how do we continue to let the family be affected by things? Or how do we call what we're doing family care? So it's really understanding that that opportunity might be the only opportunity that an African American man sees where what he's scared of is asked, or what kind of anxiety goes on, or just as importantly, to ask what's happening to you versus always creating a pathology that he's the perpetrator of a problem without doing that deeper look to see what's driving how he's looking at the world, or even hearing from him what the world is imparting on him that he doesn't know how to deal with and put back out.
Thank you.
Thank you.
A really quick question, one last comment. So, Brother Royal,
Yes,
we
ma'am.
know that, and everyone else here, that trauma for all women, regardless of even race or sexual identity, this new movement of the profession of having a doula accommodate them to reduce stress during the pregnancy, in the labor room, in the delivery room, postpartum, etc. Is there any talk about fathers getting a doula or a mentor during that time?
Actually, we have discussed that. And again, in the sense of making the birth experience holistic for the whole family. And I think that education from somebody who has that intimate relationship, who's not necessarily from a medical model that's very linearly oriented. And also the sense of creating community in a safe space, and looking at how do we incorporate men into that, and looking at that as an issue of intra-equity in the sense of where are we dropping the ball? And I always say, it's amazing. I've been doing this work for about 2 years, and for whatever reason, men are an add-on to creating children as the system looks at it. Now, I've always considered, my wife is here, and I always consider we were equal partners in all our children, so this add-on piece, and I think, but really getting at that, because what it really speaks to is even in the healthcare system, as we integrate it, and if we look at the importance of maternal mortality as infant mortality, we still see men, specifically black men, as a thing associated with humans versus a human that's part of this human experience. And I think taking that approach, as you talk about, integrating doulas for not only her but him, and making that, it creates that humanity for the whole group.
Thank you.
Okay. And we'll do a 30-second closing for each. It went down to 30 seconds. for each
All right,
panelist.
30 seconds for me. We are leaving the equity train to jump on the trauma-informed care train because we don't want to talk about racism. And we're jumping off the trauma-informed care train to talk about resiliency because that's happy. And so let us, as legislative session starts, keep all three of those things kind of at the table in the policies and the legislation that's going to start happening.
My request of community members, of people working inside systems, of those with decision-making authority, those in leadership, is as we craft the language to help people or to redress issues, especially as we look at and follow the whole kind of tenet of what we're here to do it better, is always ask two important questions. When you see policies, when you see processes, when you see work plans, these two questions. What does that mean? And who does that language serve or empower?
Just wanted to thank you all, or whoever is involved in inviting me. I learned so much. You're not a good educator if you stop learning. Think you're a know-it-all, right? So again, I've learned so much today. Really appreciate your time and your attention. I also want to shout out, I saw several of my colleagues here from OHA, Traditional Health Worker Commission. Jumped on that commission about a year and a half ago, and many of them do double duty at ORCHWA. So again, it's very grassroots people who are from the community, care about the community, want to make differences in their local community. So I just want to applaud all of my colleagues at OHA and ORCHWA, as well as each of you, again, for caring about the human spirit, and the human body and their mind as well. And in closing, my seventh child, I'm looking forward to a whole different cultural experience. My wife is Navajo, and we're going to go to the midwife. It's going to be delivered in a hogan. I mean, I don't even know what I'm in for. So, again, I'm going along for the ride. So, even tribes are very different in the things they do. People are different. Again, as long as we remain open to hearing each other's stories, that's what we did a lot of today, is sharing stories, and it really brings us to that human element. And, again, thank you for allowing me to represent my tribal community. Thank you.
Well, it's certainly a blessing and a privilege to be able to share the space. I'm a habitual butcher of quotes, so I guess maybe that's called paraphrasing. Is that right? But I'll maybe leave with a couple. One is Dr. Cornel West says, "Love is what social justice looks like in public." And I think that we can spend a lot of time thinking about despair and harm and trauma and pain, but I want us to hold hope as well. And so when I think about what love looks like, it's about building connection, right? It's about assigning value, right? Seeing folks for their full selves, right? Where we started this conversation. And the other one, it's a James Baldwin quote, and I'll do much worse on this one, but, he's talking about the power of writing and literature, right? And he says, the idea that if you can change perceptions, right? It's the goal is to change the world as challenging as that might be, but if you can change perception even by a millimeter, right, you can really move, move people and move movements. So I hope that folks also hold that I had a conversation with a colleague that I hadn't seen in years, and she said, your talk and conversation with me changed my whole course of my whole trajectory of my career. Right? It's like these simple moments of seeing each other as humans, of being able to expose people to new ideas, I think is incredibly powerful, and something that we can do in this space, we can do with each other every single day. And so I hope folks take that forward and continue to build this wonderful movement that's represented in this room.
Thank you very much to all of our panelists. Thank you to the conveners that brought all of us together here today. And I do have hope, and my hope for this conversation today is that it would be the human and the humane panel. It would be the stories, and it would be each of us connecting to the stories that were up here and the stories that are within each of us, because we all have stories and we all come from somewhere. And our destiny is intertwined. One of the conversations, I'll just say this very briefly, that we're having at the Oregon Health Authority Office of Equity and Inclusion, and the work we do for the broader Oregon Health Authority. I found myself saying many times this last year is please, please, don't see our work in equity and inclusion as subservient to the content of other disciplines. Health equity and inclusion is a discipline, and it must be held with value on equal par with budget, finance, communications, human resources, risk management. We are a discipline as well, so please treat this work as such and treat each of us doing this work with that value, because it has come to my attention that the actions are often that of subservience. So please, in your daily interactions, watch yourself and watch what you're doing and watch how you're treating each other in this work. On that note, thank you so much for your time and being attentive to our stories, and have a nice lunch.
All right. Excellent.